Welcome to the Six Hats podcast, where I, Dr. Shami, a lifestyle and nutritional medicine family doctor, will talk about how women strive to find balance each day by juggling their six roles, being a woman, mother, daughter, partner, business owner, and professional. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Six Hats podcast. I'm excited to have Nathalie Martinek back on the Six Hats podcast. Now, if you haven't heard her previous podcast, please go and listen. I think it was in I can't keep track now, season 7, another season. So go back and have a listen. But here's a short intro about Nathalie. So she's an ex-systems biology and cancer researcher turned narcissism hacker, consultant and independent medical culture researcher. Now, as a global consultant for leaders in healthcare, tech, and related industries, she now helps individuals and small groups navigate professional relationships that feature narcissistic behaviors. Now, when Nathalie and I were thinking about this podcast, I loved what she shared, and this is what I'm going to start the podcast with. So she goes, I've been thinking a lot about women who leave their good enough non-narcissist husbands and the narcissism that these women express to get what they want. And so many women blow up their marriages, blame their husbands when they are actually ignoring the root cause, which is unprocessed grief from loss of identity. Nathalie goes on to mention that this might be of interest to women who are feeling their 7-year itch, feeling dull, bored in their marriages or long-term relationships. And this can lead to self-destructive behavior that is seen as healthy and healing. And so when I heard about this, I go, Nathalie, you've got to come back on. Let's have this discussion, because I can hear so many of my listeners going, wow, is that me? Welcome, Nathalie.
Thanks, Shami. It's great to be back.
So, Nathalie, you have written an article about this, and I urge listeners to go and have a look. It's on hackingnarcissism.com. I will put the link in the show notes. But I love for you to, how did you decide to even write about this? I know you were quite vulnerable and you shared a bit about your journey. So I'd love for you to start there.
Yeah, I'm inspired by the people in my life who are going through things, and what they're going through can remind me of what I have gone through or continue to go through, but have more wisdom to be able to support that person with their own journey in that topic area. So when it comes to marriage, there's so much stuff out there, but there's so much that we don't talk about. And just having some wisdom from my own experience of not blowing up my marriage and what made me not do that has helped me to help others see that what they're going through is quite normal and common. It's not about leaving the marriage necessarily, especially if the husband is not a problem in terms of their behavior, that it's an inner journey that we need to look into. And that's not talked about enough, at least not in that way. Normally it's the more, I guess, mainstream way is more feminist and have your life, have what you want. We are free to move around society in ways that we couldn't 100 years ago. And we're almost entitled to having it all, maybe not all at once, but that message of being able to have it all. And I think that's quite misleading.
Absolutely. And I'm going to take a little snippet from your article where you go, at times I felt trapped and stuck, unable to breathe because he wasn't changing at the rate that I needed him in order to match my evolution. And I love that. I love that because it's so interesting. I laugh, right? Because there's so many things that we can relate to it. Like the woman goes on this journey, they're doing personal development, they are changing, and then they get frustrated that their husband or partner is not doing anything. And you almost want that control, isn't it? It's almost like control over the outcome of another human being that you have absolutely no control over. And that can just completely go down this rabbit hole of, is this the right relationship? Am I in the right partnership? And you can doubt yourself when you're trying to just control the outcome. But I'd love for you to start on that.
Yeah, it's easy for us to delude ourselves into believing I have outgrown my husband because look at me doing all this work. I'm evolving, I'm changing, I'm transforming. But what are my metrics for recognizing, for measuring my evolution, my transformation, and where my partner is on the yardstick compared to me? It's ridiculous. It's the same thing as people feeling like they're more spiritually advanced than anyone else. How the hell do you know? So it's our ego because there's something else going on underneath that we can't tap into because we're too busy indulging in ourselves, indulging in our process. And it's not a bad thing to do that. But when it becomes, I guess, the measurement or the requirement that your partner be on this journey with you and evolve with you, have able to talk to you about this stuff in the way that you might do with your girlfriends or the people that you're traveling with, you start to become a little demanding and trying to control who they are instead of seeing who they are, the reality of who they are, what they bring to you in your life, what they have brought to you in your life, as well as the flaws. We expect them to suddenly want to do the things that we're doing. And it's not fair. And it's not something they agreed to when we got hitched years earlier. It wasn't part of that plan. It wasn't part of an agreement. So somehow now we're forcing a conversation to create a new contractual agreement about terms and conditions for me to be able to stay married to them. And they get presented with this, or he gets presented with this, and he doesn't see it coming. It's like, where's this coming from? What's wrong with me now? This wasn't a problem a few weeks ago. Why is this a problem now? They get very confused. And I think that also acknowledging that men and women are different. We have different languages that we use to talk about things. Many men are more practical and hands-on. Many women are more emotional and okay to travel to the depths. Those are stereotypes. It's not the same with everyone, but we can come to having expectations about our partners that are highly unrealistic, and that the more we push and try to control, the more we become self-absorbed in our own project and our own mission to create the ideal family structure, the ideal marriage, the fantasy that is not based on a reality, and it could turn us into monsters.
And I hear it from so many angles because it's quite funny. Some might say, I don't want my husband to change. I want to be the same person that I married 20 years ago. And then others are like, but I've evolved, so I want him to evolve. It's almost like that unsatisfactoriness. We're always changing, and that change needs to continue to whatever we perceive our reality to be. And so that's really interesting. And I think it's something for us to be aware. But I think what you mentioned about comparison, what are we rating ourselves against? At the end of the day, it's just our perception of reality, of what we think should be the benchmark. You're absolutely right. And it's a story that we've created rather than the actual true reality. So it's almost like stories that we've created in our mind to say, well, that's not good enough, or that is good enough. That's meeting my standards. But hey, my standards are going to change depending on my mood, to be honest, or where I am. And so it's always this variable that we're putting the partners on a test. It's a test that they can't achieve the results from.
Yeah. And I think the stories don't just come from inside our heads. They're internalized from external sources. So media. So this woman, Francesca Hogi, coined the term the fairy tale industrial complex. So fantasies about the perfect relationship, the perfect marriage. If we've had parents where they have this beautiful looking relationship, that's our model. This is what we're trying to aspire to. But we're also bombarded with a whole bunch of messages from social media that drives a competitiveness to want what that other woman has, or that the picture that she paints about her perfect marriage. We don't see the behind the scenes, that's for sure. We just see what they want us to see. And we believe it on some level. And that's what we're thinking. That's what reinforces this crazy fantasy, a delusion of what a reality could be, instead of looking at the reality that we have now and working with that.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. I want to take another snippet from your article. And I love this one, that whole fantasy of marriage. And I'm laughing. A good man is a man who goes to therapy, emotionally attuned all times, yet manly enough to take control when I need him to, examines himself and does all the things I do. It's almost impossible to achieve.
Yeah. So we're wanting men to be like the idealized way we see ourselves. So we want our men to be like our narcissist fantasy, basically. Require them to do the things that we may not be doing, or believe that just because we're doing it, that's the blueprint that they need to follow as well. But I'm not able to do the things that a lot of the things that my husband does, just like he can't do some of the things that I can do. And that's why we complement so well. But we could ignore those facts and just look at what we don't have and what we want to have, because again, we're trying to live into a fantasy.
So true. So true. I'd love to sort of move on to the point where you go, okay, what was your realization? Hold on a sec. I'm creating this drama. What was the tipping point? What was your realization?
Well, it wasn't one thunderbolt experience. It was coming along the years. So there are periods where I would be in distress and then things would settle. And then other periods, again, the distress would come along and they would settle. So you go through that pattern enough. And then I came to a conclusion that the common denominator in all of this was me, not the children, the husband, the job, the friends, the family. It's me. That's my perception of what I think I should have and the expectations that I have created. So again, that came with time, because going from a narcissistic version of myself where I believe I'm entitled to this amazing life based on a fantasy to recognizing the fantasy isn't going to happen, accepting that fantasy is dead, and then starting to become more at peace with the way things are, knowing that I'm not in an abusive relationship. I have a good husband, he's a good father, all those things. So those are the stabilizers or the anchors that help me finally ground myself in my reality. So it was a process. And what can happen sometimes is when our own children are going through strife or struggle and we can't necessarily put our finger on what's going on, there isn't a clear fix to the symptoms we're seeing in our child's own distress. That's sort of, for me, that was my wake-up call, that it's not something that's going on with her. It's something that's going on with me, and that there's a projection going on, or there's some sort of enmeshment going on. And I need to figure out how I'm contributing to this distress that I've been seeing as external to me.
Is it almost blaming or putting the responsibility onto someone else for your happiness?
It can. Yeah, it is. Even though you might not admit it, you might go, I'm trying to find happiness within myself. I'm doing all these things and I'm feeling satisfied by them. You should come along for this ride and give me what I need to maintain that happiness. Yeah, but essentially is if I control you and you do what I want, then I'll be happy.
So true, so true. I want to go back to this fantasy because I think, I can relate to that. Just growing up as a teenager, reading all those books and about what love is and what relationships are about. And then you start watching TV programs. And where I grew up, it was very American based or British based. And then it's so true. It actually becomes your reality of what the Hollywood film displays as true romance versus what you're actually seeing in reality. And it almost creates this confusion in your mind because that's what you want. You want that fantasy. It looks amazing. But then you're having this tug of war with reality. And do you feel that's an issue in today's world when, I don't know the stats, but many women are now reaching their 30s, single, looking for their partner. It's taking a lot longer to find their life partner. Are we confused over what relationships are about versus what we want?
Yeah, I think it depends on the socioeconomic class of the person, where they're at in their life or their own development. I think for women who are high achievers, they've had some strong ambitions that they've been able to attain, and they want somebody who they believe is their equal, but their equal has to be making a lot of money, be well established. And so again, it comes down to these practicalities, and they need to be warm and loving and all those other things. But we're asking a lot instead of looking at a strong character. And not to say that we forget our, financial security, but there's certain standards that people look towards as believing that that's their match. That is, again, based on a fantasy. And the fantasy is not just the picture. It's the feeling that it gives us when we tap into it. So we want the feeling. It's the addiction to the feeling and feeling good that drives our behavior towards trying to create that for ourselves. It's not just the picture. So we're constantly searching for that thing that gives us the feeling, which is crazy because you can have the feeling just through visualizing. You don't have to create that fantasy for you to access it. And so that's a major part of the problem, where we become more focused on our feelings versus rational thinking, logic, practical type of things. And again, this is a generalization. It's not everyone, but I think women in their 30s, if we look the way things are now versus maybe 50 years ago, it's very different. What women have been able to attain and claim as their own and have the independence that they have without needing any man, well, then what do they need a man for? So kind of created this situation where it's hard to find a partner that we can respect because our requirements for ourselves are so high.
So true. And explained beautifully as well. I sort of want to move on to, you mentioned also about the grief of losing your identity. How was that all sort of involved in your journey?
Again, another thing that's not spoken about a lot is the concept of matrescence. So it's the becoming of a mother. But you don't become a mother when you give birth to your child or you become a mother to a child, however that child comes into your life. That's a beginning, so to speak, but it's a process of maturation into embody that mother. And so for me personally, I had a hard time becoming embodying mother, accepting that I'm mother, even though, yes, intellectually I know I'm a mother, but it didn't kind of hit me until 10 years into being a mother. And so because I was juggling this professional identity, so I have to be this scientist or I have to be this kind of professional person with label. I'm also a woman. I'm also a wife. And now I'm a mother, and it comes with a whole set of responsibility and duties. And I wasn't able to integrate all those things because what I ended up doing was prioritizing one label or identity over the mother identity. I didn't make it my top identity, but I didn't. And I don't know if that's what you're supposed to do, but that's not what I did. So it took time for me to actually get into the place where I can appreciate this is my role. Not that I was a neglectful mother, but I didn't, in my mind, believe that it was a high enough caliber, position, status compared to all these other identities that I had access to. And I think that's again what happens. The bullshit I internalized that, you could have it all, and having a professional career and a path is super important, credentials, all these things. You work so hard to get them. You don't want to now downgrade them because you've evolved into some other form in your life and you've taken on another identity. But yeah, so I feel like that got in the way of me being able to embody mother. So when I left my role as a scientist, that was a massive shift in my identity. I basically removed that from my life, my being, my ego, my sense of self. And I'd invested so much in seeing myself in that way. So there was a loss there. And I grieved it, but not extensively because I found other things to interest me. And so as a mother, you have the person you were before you gave birth suddenly dying the moment you become a mother. But again, do we do any mourning of this? Some people might, but do we have these kind of initiation rituals that acknowledge that go beyond celebrating the birth of the baby? I'm now a different person, but everyone's acting like nothing's changed except I'm a mother now and I have this baby and the attention's on the baby. So as I'm going through these phases, as my first daughter became one, again, I'm now a mother of a 1-year-old. Whereas a year ago, I was a mother to a newborn, and then again, and then a mother to 2 daughters. And so I'm constantly changing. But am I grieving the losses of all those identities? No, because I didn't know I needed to. So after a while, these kind of identities, these dead identities pile up and they accumulate and they create some sort of burden inside. That's the best way I can describe it. And I haven't held space for them to acknowledge the role that they played in my life and me becoming the mother I am today or at that time, what it took for me to do that. I kind of took that for granted. Whereas those parts of me were like, no, we need to be celebrated. We need to be acknowledged. We need to be seen. And then you can bury us and move on. So we are missing a lot of this kind of ritual and an acknowledgement that we undergo initiation rites along the way in the becoming of mother, that it's not a one-off thing in your mother, it's actually an evolution. That's the way I've come to see it. And that's what's made sense to me and has helped me to kind of do my best to embody it and honor the responsibilities and the incredible privilege that comes with being a mother.
I think so many of my listeners are going to relate to that. And I can already think of many patients who are actually struggling with that identity loss, whether it's the identity of being a high-powered, high executive, earning well, traveling the world, and then giving all of that up to become a mother and realizing, wow, I'm not even earning anything. What does that look like? And it's that constant battle of, I wanted to be a mother, but I've just totally lost my identity of my career. And they struggle with that. And what I really want to mention here is that it can affect you mentally, and it can come out in depression. It can come out in anxiety. It can come out in difficulty sleeping. It can come out in the form of emotional eating. There's so many ways it can actually translate to into physical and mental health when we haven't addressed the root cause. And that's why I think conversations like this is so important, to actually bring it to the forefront and go, you're not alone. Many, many women feel this way. What can we do about it? And the other side of the coin is, I know many patients who didn't start their career because they dedicated it to their husband's career or motherhood. And when their kids are much older and they've left home and the husband's like, oh, business is going great, kids are left home, they're feeling so lost and then they don't know where to go. And that comes out in depression, emotional eating, weight changes. And it's going back to the root cause of I gave up. I gave up my life to other people, and I'm still sacrificing my life for other people because you fall into a pattern of habits where it's all about the kids and the husband. But what about you? And I often say to patients, what about you? What are you doing for you? And often they're feeling very lost of actually, I've dedicated my entire life for others. And it just comes out, when they're perhaps it's perimenopause, menopause, when the kids are much older, then you've got this combination of hormones and feeling lost. And where's my identity? And I think it's really important to celebrate that and really acknowledge that you're important. You're like what you described, all these identities that we never really thought about because society looks at it as very fluid. You just fall into another. Everyone looks happy on social media. Everyone's doing really well. But deep down, you're like, I really miss being an executive. I'm bored of the routine of motherhood. And it's really important to have these real conversations as well.
Yeah. And the loss of identity comes with a demotion in status. So there's a part of you that it affects your worth and your value as a human. And you go into the shame response, the shame spiral, which we've talked about, I think, on another podcast. So the shame is what conjures these narratives about our value and worth. That's why we can feel lost. But if we have busy lives, then we're just going to find another way to distract ourselves and avoid dealing with the things. And what do we do instead? We blame the husband. We blame our circumstances. We blame the fact that we don't have this fantasy because what's going on inside is just, we can't even touch it. It's too much or so hidden under the surface. We don't even know it's there, but it's creating these manifestations of this unprocessed grief is in all those symptoms that you described and more.
Absolutely. I want to touch more on, it might be a challenge for people to hear that you can have narcissistic traits when you're on this journey. Can you sort of elaborate on that?
Yeah. So the narcissistic traits are that, so we become very self-absorbed and self-centered, but believe, so we are doing these things. So our behavior is expressing self-absorption, entitlement, control tactics, domination tactics, where we want others to basically bow to our needs. But our perception of ourselves is that we are saintly, we are martyrs, we're doing all the things that we're expected to do, and then some. We're doing all the emotional labor in the house and all these things that is perception. But if you were to write down and document all the things that you're doing and not doing, you might have a different, story coming out. But we don't do that. We just see ourselves in a particular way. And anyone that gets in the way of or tries to disrupt that self-image, that ideal self-image, well, they threaten us and they get punished. So when our husband says to us, we're acting selfishly, or I don't know why you're acting this way, this doesn't make sense, we lash out because we're trying to preserve this image of ourselves because our egos are so fragile in that moment because of the distress that is underneath it. So what isn't, again, spoken about is when we're feeling distressed. So if people are in, say, an abusive relationship, what can come out as see this narcissistic behavior is a response to the distress of losing control, being restricted, being controlled by someone else, but not having necessarily the awareness that that's what's going on. So your friends will be like, what's wrong with you, Nat? You seem more tense, you seem more snappy. And I'll be like, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just fine. Mm-hmm. So that's an example. So even in our non-abusive relationships, the stress would make us become very self-centered and entitled to the life that you promised me that I would have, or I imagined I was going to have. And the fact that I don't have it means you've betrayed me. I can't trust you anymore. And so now I'm going to blame you and shame you and do all the things. And that makes me narcissistic because I'm not taking any responsibility for the contributions I've made into the relationship and the current conditions of the relationship. I'm making it all about what the other person needs to do for me, for my happiness and satisfaction. So this is common. And this comes around during those periods where we're feeling distressed because there's a reckoning going on and there's a beckoning to pay attention to the identities that you've left behind that are no longer part of your life, but are kind of still connected to you. You haven't grieved them. You've gone through so many changes and you're not clear about who you are anymore. So you need to stop blaming everyone and look at yourself and acknowledge there's some stuff here that I've left behind that needs some attention. And that comes around with that 7-year itch. That's part of the process that, again, we don't talk about in the way that we're discussing it now. It's kind of like, the 7-year itch. It's when we just get a little bit, both husband, wife, or both parties in the relationship get resentful or bored or feel stuck. But I'm talking about it as something actually, a lot of the time, it's the woman in the relationship that is kind of driving this dissatisfaction that is experienced in the relationship. Not always, but yeah.
Let's talk about that, because I think you mentioned you read some research around the 7-year itch actually exists.
Yeah. So 7, for people who are a little bit more spiritually inclined or think about cycles of nature and the rhythms of nature and patterns in the universe, that sort of thing. Well, 7 has symbolism. In the Jewish tradition, it's associated with a sabbatical. So every 7 years, there's a change in the land, and you're supposed to give it rest and not plant anything and leave it alone. And that way it can regenerate and allow for growth and prosperity in the next years. So it's a way, and again, a Sabbath, where you take a break and you rest and you take stock of, your life or whatever. You're just not being active. You're not being distracted. You're just being very present with what's going on. Rudolf Steiner says that 7 years is known for a period of reflection and transformation, that we actually undergo a transformative process in the 7-year mark throughout our lives. But if you think about a marriage or any long-term relationship where two people have committed to each other, especially if you've committed lifelong to each other, you're going to go through this journey together. So 7 years has a cycle, and it's a transformative year. And it's an important year to kind of go, okay, things are happening here. I'm not feeling like our marriage is getting anywhere, or we don't even think about it. We just keep going and we don't question anything too deeply. So there is some wisdom here around this. Actually, the 7-year is supposed to happen. It's meant to happen. And it's an opportunity to take stock and create some change that you invest in the next 7 years. And I could say I've been married 21 years last month.
Amazing.
So that's 3 7-year cycles. And I've gone through this time around was minimal, but the last 2 were very intense. The first 7 years was the most intense. The 14-year mark, there was intensity. And I knew, this is another 7 years, the next 7-year itch. But I didn't recognize that actually it's actually normal.
And I'd love for you to share, what did you do to support yourself on this journey? Because I honestly believe there's no hard and fast rules. There's no guideline. And it's sort of go inwards and go, what do I need? But what did you do, Natalie?
Well, the first 7 years was a hot mess, and I wouldn't recommend what I did. But it was just kind of blowing up my life almost practically, because I thought, my marriage is over. I'm not fulfilled. I hate my life. I hate my professional life. I feel enslaved or restricted. So was my thinking at the time. And I could have gone down a very self-destructive path. What I realized in that time is my time as a scientist was coming to an end, and I needed to move out of there and move on into something else because it wasn't satisfying me. And not that improved everything, but it was a major thing that brought some relief, that helped me focus on, okay, there's the professional stuff, and then there's the marriage stuff, there's the mother stuff. I can compartmentalize and look at it. In the next 7-year cycle, I was a little bit more evolved in my thinking, as well as my ability to more resource to be able to look into what's going on. So I had support from friends and spiritual guidance and things like that to help me tap into a responsible way of seeing my marriage that wasn't about blaming, even though I was doing quite a bit of that. Yeah, that wasn't entirely about blaming. And then this time around, I got a bit itchy, and it became more about my environment and wanting to change it up. And then I realized, here we go again. Time to sit and just let some of that stuff go. What have I changed in the last 7 years? What have I uncovered? What have I developed? What have I accomplished? Who am I now as a mother compared to how I was 7 years ago, as well as a wife? So I recognize 21 years later.
Amazing.
Yeah, that it's an internal process that is occurring, and it's a transformation, and it's necessary, and it's a good thing.
Amazing, and so much wisdom, Natalie. And thank you for sharing. And I really, when I was listening to that, I go, thank you so much for being vulnerable and sharing that story, because I think that's what we need to do as women. It's so easy to put on an amazing show, amazing front, going, I'm doing it all, having it all, but internalizing. And from my perspective, this is what I see when you do internalize chronic stress. You see it in the physical symptoms and mental symptoms. And I think conversations like this are so therapeutic, so rewarding to have, because you go, I'm not alone. And what's more important is that we can do something about it, whether it's seeking therapy or speaking to good friends about it, creating your tribe, finding solutions for yourself, working on yourself, but also supporting yourself. So really, really wise words, Nathalie. What an amazing conversation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Shelby.
Last few words before we leave you. And of course, I'll put in the show notes where people can find you and follow your work.
Yeah, as I'm talking about all these things, I'm like, I don't want people to think that we just excuse our husbands with the things that they could do with, some work on. It's being able to negotiate with them and talk to them about things that are getting in the way and probably that you've raised in the past multiple times. It's just coming from a different energy where you're not trying to control them and try to make them change so that you're happy. You've accepted that this is how they are. You've come back to reality. You have some more anchors in your life. You're stable. You recognize the stability that partner brings, even though they're doing things that can be quite predictable and consistent and annoying. At least it's predictable, consistent. So that's a stabilizing thing. And us women can be a little bit up ourselves and all over the place, but believe that we're the grounded, sensible ones in the relationship, when in fact it's maybe the partner that is helping us be grounded. So not excusing some of the things they're doing, but not also trying to change them, and getting a more and more realistic perspective on ourselves in relation to our spouse and our marriage overall.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you so much, Nathalie.
Thank you, Jamie.
Remember that this is general advice only. Please see your healthcare professional for more information. So what's your take-home message today? Remember, it's all about progress and not perfection. And are you suffering from stress? Visit the Usawa Learning Hub on usawa.com.au for more resources on how to de-stress, re-energize, and reclaim your health. Enjoy the journey.